Thanks everybody for joining us on this sunny and beautiful November 20th meeting date for our York County Coalition for Clean Water. This is our last meeting of the year. We have guests today, Carly Dean from the Chesapeake Conservancy and Brian Stipe from the Center of Watershed Protection. They are going to be presenting the Conowingo WIP to us, and we will be given the opportunity to make comments about that in the chat, which will be considered public comment, and just voice our opinions, questions, and however you feel. So I'm going to pass it over to Carly. You can share your screen.
Okay, can everybody see my screen now?
Looks great, Carly.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, Pam. Thanks everyone for having us on the agenda today. We really appreciate the time during the Coalition for Clean Water, during the Coalition for Clean Waters meeting here. As Rachel mentioned, our team has been working with the Chesapeake Bay program, as well as the steering committee over the past year or so on developing a Conowingo watershed implementation plan, also called the CWIP. So as part of this, we are engaging stakeholders across the priority geography, which does include York County. And the purpose of these outreach meetings are to, like Rachel mentioned, collect your public comment, answer any questions that you might have as you hopefully have the chance to read through some of the materials. We're going to give some background information today. But as we're going through, I just want you all to keep in mind the feasibility and potential for including some of your ideas about how BMP implementation can occur in York County. So anything that you have to offer, recommendations about what we should be including, areas of challenges that your community has faced that we can address through this new CWIP that's designed to be innovative. So anything that you want to share either verbally or in the chat box, our team is going to be documenting that and putting together a report that we will submit to the steering committee as well as the EPA covering the public comment. We'll give you the chance to review that before we send it out so that we're sure that we've captured all of your ideas. So that's kind of the basis and why we reached out to Rachel and to the Planning Commission to get on your agenda today. But for the rest of the introduction, I'm going to pass it over to Ruth Hawker from Center for Watershed Protection, who's also on our outreach team.
So yes, many thanks to Rachel and the Planning Commission for having us on your agenda this afternoon. Carly, if you want to go ahead and advance the slides. I'm sure you guys are already familiar with Brian and Carly, and some of you I know very well. Some of you I don't know so well, but my name is Ruth Hawker. I'm the Pennsylvania Director for the Center for Watershed Protection, and I'm joined today by Brian Stipe and Carly Dean. Brian is a Senior Project Manager with the Center for Watershed Protection and is lead for the Conowingo WIP on the grantee side, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And Carly is our partner. She's with the Chesapeake Conservancy, who's going to talk about how we developed some of the Conowingo WIP. Next slide. So just as a quick outline for today's webcast or web meeting, we're going to talk a little bit about why there's a need for the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan, what the framework is behind the WIP, how we plan to work together to achieve the goals that are outlined in the WIP, and what the roles and responsibilities of the entities involved in this process, including the intentions for this meeting, are. A review of the primary CWIP strategy, and then ample time for Q&A and discussion. Next slide.
Could I pause real quick, Ruth? We have a question from Kate Beats in the chat box that maybe we should address before moving through the comments. Can you see that, Ruth? or would you like me to?
Nope. Okay, so the question is whether or not verbal and comments written in the chat are acceptable forms of public comment, or is it only those comments written in the chat box? So just to clarify, and I should have addressed this in the beginning, so thank you very much for your question. The comments that are typed into the chat box will be made part of the formal public comment record. Verbal comments are part of the discussion and will be captured in our notes, but will not become part of the formal public comment record. So if you have anything that you would like to have included in that formal public comment document, please type it into the chat box anytime during the webinar. And you can also, there's also an opportunity to email comments again later to an email that will be posted in a later slide. Thanks, Carly. So a little bit of background. Why do we need a Conowingo WIP? Well, the need really stems from the fact that there's a large amount of additional load to deal with. And it's essentially coming from the 27,500 square mile Susquehanna River Basin, which all drains to the Conowingo Reservoir and the Conowingo Dam. The Conowingo Reservoir and Conowingo Dam were built in 1928 and are currently owned and operated by Exelon Corporation as a hydroelectric dam. The Conowingo Dam and the other dams in the lower Susquehanna, including the York Haven, Safe Harbor, and Holtwood dams, as shown on this map, have historically trapped and stored sediment and pollutants and kept them from reaching the Chesapeake Bay. So basically, they were acting as BMPs themselves. In 2015, though, a study by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Maryland Department of Environment found that the reservoir at the Conowingo Dam had reached dynamic equilibrium and that it was no longer trapping sediment and associated nutrients. So a dynamic equilibrium essentially means that as loads build up behind the dam, large storms come through and will flush whatever is accumulated behind it out and create a little bit of space. In that little bit of space, some additional load will fill in, but eventually another storm will come through and it will push out again. So essentially, over the long term, the dam is no longer trapping sediments and nutrients over a long period of time and is no longer behaving as a BMP. As a result, when the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership started to develop their watershed plans, their phase 3 WIPs, they discovered a gap of about 6 million pounds of nitrogen and about 0.26 million pounds of phosphorus that wasn't accounted for. Again, because at the time, the original assumption was that the dams were functioning as BMPs and were providing some attenuation of sediment and nutrients. Now that that's not happening anymore, there's this gap and we're trying to mitigate the water quality impacts of that Conowingo Reservoir infill by addressing those additional 6 million pounds of nitrogen and 0.26 million pounds of phosphorus. Next slide. So in December of 2017, the Chesapeake Bay Partnership agreed to develop a separate Conowingo planning target and to collectively develop a separate Conowingo WIP. All of the principal staff committee, or the PSC, agreed to pool their resources and identify a process to fund and implement the Conowingo WIP. So that's the additional load that the Bay jurisdiction agreed to work on collaboratively, those 6 million pounds of nitrogen, to try to address. There's a variety of entities involved in this process. First up is EPA, who is evaluating the CWIP. They provide biannual evaluations of progress and work with the PSC to determine whether or not adjustments are necessary as we advance. They've issued a request for applications for third-party grantees. That's us here at the Center for Watershed Protection and Carly at the Chesapeake Conservancy to administer those cooperative agreements, which they administer. They also provide technical staff and additional contractor support for this effort. There's a CWIP steering committee, which consists of representatives from each of the Bay jurisdictions, including Delaware, DC, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and also includes the Chesapeake Bay Commission. The CWIP steering committee is there to solicit comments from stakeholders, to develop the CWIP with EPA staff and our support, and to guide the development of a CWIP financing strategy and the implementation of that strategy, which is currently ongoing. Finally, there's the PSC, or the Principal Staff Committee. They are there to approve the final draft ultimately for submittal to the Chesapeake Bay Partnership. They provide comment on the draft and on the final. They review the progress of the steering committee in the development and implementation of the WIP. And so essentially this is the way this is set up so that the steering committee works collectively on developing the strategies, and Principal Staff Committee reviews and approves those for advancement. Next slide. So the additional roles and responsibilities for the CWIP is divided into 3 activities. They are all funded by EPA. The first activity, which is what we're really talking about today, is to facilitate the development and implementation of the Conowingo WIP and the associated 2-year milestones. This process is being led by the Center for Watershed Protection with support from the Chesapeake Conservancy, University of Maryland Sea Grant Extension, and the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology. Together, our goal is to provide overall assistance to the CWIP steering committee to develop a plan to develop the 2-year milestones for the CWIP so that we can effectively target practices to reduce pollutant loadings, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few slides. We'll also be establishing a timeline to achieve them. And finally, we will be conducting, as we are today, watershed-wide stakeholder outreach. EPA also has others working on some of the other activities you see listed here. Activity 2 is developing and proposing a comprehensive financing strategy and associated implementation plan. This process is currently ongoing and is being led by the Chesapeake Bay Trust, and it's primarily being carried out by the Center for Global Sustainability in the School for Public Policy at the University of Maryland and Throw Environmental. Their goal is to develop, propose, and implement the Conowingo financing strategy and identify necessary financing approaches, assess legal authorities, restrictions, and processes necessary to propose a multi-jurisdictional and multi-sector finance and investment system, and to link the economic development to restoration finance. So again, that process is currently ongoing. Finally, there's a third activity, and that's tracking and verifying and reporting implementation of CWIP in the 2-year milestones. This activity is being led by the Chesapeake Conservancy with support from comments and the Center for Watershed Protection. This will really build on the work that the partners are already doing to streamline and consolidate tracking and verification of processes as they go into the ground. Most importantly, I think it's important to note that this initiative provides a unique opportunity for all of us to build on existing and successful programs that are already being used to achieve the Chesapeake Bay goals into as much as possible and as much as feasible, avoid creating duplicative bureaucracies, and maybe even finding some additional opportunities for creative financing and innovative BMPs. At this time, I will shift the presentation over to Carly, and she'll take it from here.
Thank you, Ruth. So I did kind of cover this in the brief introduction. The intentions of this meeting, we will give you some more background into the primary CWIP strategy and put that in the context that's locally relevant to York County and to Pennsylvania. We are here to answer any questions that you might have about the CWIP. So second half of today's presentation, I guess you could say, today's meeting will be dedicated to an open discussion. And then as Ruth mentioned, and as Kate asked in the text box, we will document the discussion and present that to the steering committee as part of the public comment report that we are putting together. So you'll have the chance to review that before it goes out, but it will be, we want to make sure that your recommendations, your questions and concerns get in front of the steering committee. That's part of our role here during this outreach. Again, As we go through the primary CWIP strategy that was selected by the steering committee, consider these different ideas for the discussion part: feasibility, any additional capacity you need, any additional capacity needs in York County, costs that have been estimated, anything else that's missing. This is really the opportunity to be innovative and to make specific recommendations about what you'd like to see in a new approach, an innovative approach to watershed implementation planning. So when the Chesapeake Bay program, the Principal Staff Committee was first developing the framework for the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan, a big emphasis was put on cost effectiveness, which is directly related to this concept of nitrogen effectiveness. The map that you see on the right identifies the areas that are considered to be most effective at delivering nitrogen to the Chesapeake Bay and have the greatest impact in the bay on dissolved oxygen. So essentially, this is directly related to cost effectiveness in that if you were to reduce 1 pound of nitrogen on the landscape, in particular in these areas in dark red, that will have a large impact on the dissolved oxygen in the bay. And in comparison, for example, based on this nitrogen effectiveness model, in the areas that are lighter pink, you may have to reduce up to 5 pounds of nitrogen loading in order to have that same impact on dissolved oxygen in the bay. So you'd have to do essentially 5 times more work, which is why this was a good starting point for the Chesapeake Bay program when they developed the framework for the CWIP. The map you see here, the geographies or the planning units are land river segments. And those can be thought of as, they're about the same size as a Huck 12 watershed. And they also consider political boundaries. So they are, they're basically water segments that are divided by land political boundaries for the purpose of planning. This is the same unit that the Bay program considers in the Chesapeake Bay Assessment Scenario Tool, or CAST. And it's and effectiveness is also part of that CAST model. So that was the starting point. Let's look at the most effective basins, most effective land river segments within the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. And the steering committee then evaluated a variety of different scenarios and geographies. And ultimately, this geography had the full consensus of the CWIP steering committee members. And so essentially, we are looking at the above the median nitrogen effective land river segments within the Susquehanna River Basin. So the priority geographies in the primary CWIP strategy are shown here in gray. The scenario, again, that the CWIP steering committee selected as the primary CWIP strategy for implementation is within this geography. It also includes a variety of agricultural and urban best management practices. This geography covers portions of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York. And when looking at these BMP sectors and these geographies, the BMP implementation targets that have been outlined in the CWIP will achieve 6.7 million pounds of nitrogen reduction per year, which exceeds the target that was set forth by the steering committee of 6 million pounds. The annualized cost is $53.3 million per year, and that was based on CAST cost profiles. And the cost per pound of nitrogen reduction is $8. In Pennsylvania, you'll see that many counties are part of the primary CWIP geography, but it's important to note that some of them have very few few acres of land area within the geography. But of course, York was identified as one of the most effective places to reduce nitrogen, and most of the county is within that primary CWIP geography. So the geography was selected. Let's talk about the best management practices that appear in the CWIP implementation. We wanted to consider nitrogen reduction efficiency. That was the pollutant of interest for the primary CWIP strategy. We do have phosphorus goals, but the models and the BMPs selected were primarily focused on nitrogen, and we can explain that a little bit more later. The best management practices selected were also based on the application in the Susquehanna River Basin. So if they were applied in this particular geography, we want to make sure that those are also the most nitrogen effective practices in this particular geography. Cost effectiveness, again, that was based on the cost profiles, and those were developed in partnership with the jurisdictions. And there is an intention for some equity between urban and agricultural practices. Now I'm going to go through the models that were used and the modeling process that helped us get to the implementation targets that are included in the primary CWIP strategy. Our team used CAST to model these strategies, and we went through 4 steps. So we started with the baseline of the implementation of each state's phase 3 WIP for agricultural BMP. That was our starting point. The Conowingo WIP is an independent implementation plan, an independent target. So the first assumption is that the phase 3 WIPs are fully implemented, and then the 6 million pounds could be over and above those existing phase 3 WIP targets. So in this table, we just looked at, just for an example, I'm just showing you 2 best management practices. And the modeling process, again, step number 1 here is looking at the maximum land river segment scale levels of implementation from the WIP 3 by state, okay? So this number you see here is the % of land area implemented. This was what was already in the phase 3 WIPs. So then we bumped up implementation across the entire CWIP geography until those BMPs reached the 6 million pound reduction goal, again, over and above the phase 3 WIP goals. So then we were left with, for these particular practices, 90% of the land area is dedicated to this particular best management practice. So again, we started with ag, but then we wanted to add in urban practices on top of that as well. So we actually only looked at these 2 urban practices, so urban forest planting and urban forest buffers. We set some BMP implementation targets and then backed away the ag implementation targets until we were back down at a reasonable level for implementation feasibility as well as costs. I know that this is a little bit technical, but we can answer any questions as we go through. Ultimately, the ag practices were bumped down to 95% of the implementation levels, and these urban practices were added in. The intent, again, was some equity between the urban and agricultural sector. These were the BMPs that were ultimately included, and the implementation targets across the entire CWIP geography. So I'll leave this up on the screen for a second so that you can read through this list. It's important to note that the steering committee had a preference for just being really mindful and really aware of practices that would take farmland out of production. So you will see that there are forest buffers and wetland restoration, grass buffers on here as practices, but we did kind of work through a number of different scenarios to weight some of those practices that kept farmland in production, as to not take out too much farmland for Conowingo WIP implementation. This is how the implementation breaks down by state. You'll note that the nitrogen reduction exceeds the target by 700,000 pounds. Again, we did not meet the phosphorus target, so in the future we could explore potential trade-offs between phosphorus and nitrogen. 95% of the load reduction does occur in Pennsylvania, and 89% of the total load reduction does occur in the agricultural sector. A couple thoughts about the how the CWIP strategy is complementary with the Pennsylvania County action plans. So right now we're in the phase 1 of this entire of the outreach piece of Conowingo watershed implementation planning. So we are doing 15 stakeholder meetings across the entire priority CWIP geography. And we've been coordinating really closely with PADEP to ensure that the input that you all provide and that the development of the CWIP aligns with the local perceptions and local messaging and planning efforts associated with the county action plans. So the reason that we're reaching out to York County specifically, as well as the 7 other Tier 1 and Tier 2 counties, is to get your input on how specifically we can make sure that this aligns with the county action plans. This is not intended to be an additional plan over and above what you've already been working on. But we'd like to hear your lessons learned as you've been going through this CAP process. How can the Conowingo WIP address any challenges that you've come across? And then how can we ensure that that's built into the Conowingo WIP as it moves through the revision process? When it comes to milestone planning, again, this is not intended to add any loads to what you've already indicated in your county action plan, but we are working closely with PADEP to see if the counties that have not yet done their CAPs, see if we can work with them to incorporate some of these Conowingo targets into their CAPs, so the Tier 3 and Tier 4 counties. Implementation. The implementation phase, which is set to begin in 2022, the way that the county action plans can benefit, or the implementation of the county action plans can benefit from this new Conowingo watershed implementation plan, is through the technical assistance that is provided by the implementation team, which includes, again, led by Center for Watershed Protection, Chesapeake Conservancy, and the other partners. And we'll be working with you closely throughout this process to collect any feedback and make any revisions to the plan and milestones. So now I'll pass it off to Brian to talk through challenges and opportunities.
Great. Thank you, Carly. And thank you, Ruth, for that great introduction. And thank you all for joining us today. We really do appreciate your time and your feedback and your input as we work through this significant challenge. And that's just to make it clear, we're under no illusion that this is not a challenge, right? The Conowingo Dam issue has been around for a while. And this, I think, unique way of tackling it is hopefully going to work out well for everyone, and certainly it's a way to get the states to all work together to solve this problem and not just put the burden on any one party. So, but we're under no illusion that there are not significant challenges and or opportunities associated with the development of the WIP as well as the implementation of it. And so the first one really relates to refining our cost estimates. So we use the CAS tool and the state cost profiles found in CAS to determine the costs associated with the implementation of the WIP. However, there is an understanding that number doesn't fully capture the cost of the technical assistance and the outreach needed to get to these levels of implementation. We've made a stab at that. We've taken an attempt to estimate what we think that would be, potentially somewhere around $12 million a year. That was really just based off of information found in Pennsylvania state WIP. What we're trying to understand particularly better from you all who are engaged in the CAP process, who are really, in the trenches on this, is, what are we really talking about in terms of additional technical services, additional technical assistance, outreach assistance that's needed to go above and beyond what you're already planning on doing for the CAP. We understand that there are probably deficiencies there, and you're trying to figure out how are we going to bridge that gap, and that's understood, and we get that. What we need to understand as those people representing the Conowingo WIP is, what additional resources do we need to bring to bear to do more, to get there? Again, the responsibility for this is on the Conowingo WIP. This is not part of the jurisdictional WIP. It's a standalone WIP. And what we want to do is we want to work with you and work with the agricultural community and the urban community to get this work done. We think there's opportunities for us each to work together, but we need to get a better handle on the costs associated with that. And we hope that you all have some information you're willing to share with us there. Additionally, you'll note on that slide that Carly showed earlier with the BMPs, and Carly did a great job of describing that. The steering committee was very concerned with removing land from production, from conversion of agricultural land into other uses. Certainly there is some of that in there, but there were concerns about how much land are we converting. And so by that nature, we started to kind of really play with these annual practices versus structural practices. And as you may imagine, there are significant differences between how we would implement those, how they would be financed, how we would track them, etc. What we really want from you all is to consider the feasibility and the costs associated with implementing annual practices versus structural practices, whether you have a recommendation of one over the other, or thoughts on the types of BMPs within those sort of broad categories. Again, the concern of the steering committee was to avoid taking too much land out of agricultural production, but still focus on those highly efficient, cost-effective, and efficient BMPs for nitrogen reduction. Today is really what we're kind of starting to dig into in terms of engaging the public to ground truth the modeled primary implementation scenario and geography for feasibility. So as Carly indicated, the process so far has really focused on working at the state level, looking at the existing state WIP documents, utilizing information that the states have submitted to EPA with regard to their WIPs on the CAS models and the BMP inputs and all of that information. So that's kind of what we have been using, and Carly described how we looked at maximum levels of implementation and tried to figure out what are our caps, what's our baseline, etc. We also know that that's also model land. It doesn't always necessarily reflect what's going on the ground. So really what we need to hear from you all who are in the trenches on the front lines, making this progress towards the Chesapeake WIP is, what is the reality of this scenario, the BMPs we've got, and the geography that we've identified for getting this work done. Understanding that, especially when it comes to geography, as Carly explained, there are trade-offs when we move around. York County and the areas we've identified are the most effective locations to work. So we really want to try to work here, but we also want to ground truth what we're seeing in the model versus what you all know, being on the ground and being involved in this process for a longer period of time. And then finally, the things that we're certainly working on is considering and trying to resolve tracking, accounting, and crediting issues, particularly as they relate to the Conowingo WIP and the jurisdictional WIPs. Again, the Conowingo WIP is separate. We cannot double count. We can't take credit for work that the jurisdictions are doing. We are trying to dovetail with that. We are trying to support it, but we have to come up with our own load reductions that we will report just like the jurisdictions do through a 2-year milestone process and evaluated just like the state of Pennsylvania is. The only difference is this is a WIP without a state. So it's just like the state whip, just we don't have a state. We have a geography that we're working in, so to speak. So we need to track and account for those projects correctly. Some projects may be more easily tracked and accounted for from one category for one a whip to the other, and some may be more difficult. So considering how we could work together to help resolve mutual tracking and accounting and crediting issues associated with tracking BMPs, and in particular on our end, ensuring that we're not double counting practices that should be or are being counted towards the Chesapeake whip. Next slide. So implementation, this is a huge challenge. We've talked about, that it's understood that you all are already being asked to do a lot to meet the jurisdictional whip. And so we really want to try to figure out a way to implement the Conowingo whip that is supportive and dovetails with those efforts. So the first one is to basically support, to provide additional funding for existing state cost share programs. So essentially the Conowingo whip here would provide additional funding to those existing programs to essentially do more work, to provide more boots on the ground, to provide more resources to get BMPs implemented on the landscape. But essentially, again, this would require support. It's understood. It would require financial support from the Chesapeake whip, from the financing that's supporting the whip, to provide additional funding for these state cost share programs. But certainly that's one avenue that we see as existing now, that with additional funding could potentially provide an avenue for implementation for the Conowingo whip. The second potential option is utilizing existing organizations with financing capacity. So these organizations must be able to fund large-scale restoration projects at scale and across state lines. And the financing team has been doing some work to evaluate organizations that have this capacity. These would be people like the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation or others that have a track record of funding large-scale implementation projects in different states. So essentially utilizing or funneling Conowingo funding through those entities to provide funding for implementation in the targeted geography. And finally is performance-based contracting. This one is an interesting approach in that we feel like it's one way to help potentially bring the private sector into the game, allowing them to find and provide projects and BMPs that essentially provide very cost-effective results for nitrogen. The idea with performance-based contracting is the contract essentially based off of what we're interested in, which is nitrogen. So it leaves it open really a little bit to how that nitrogen is provided, that reduction is provided. It has to be provided via an approved BMP, but there's recognition that people on the landscape, that private companies and others may be able to come up with ways to implement projects that are extremely cost effective, either because they're doing it at scale, or they have developed some new technology, or they have a way to reduce transaction costs, etc. But performance-based contracting is something that we view as a way to potentially bring the private sector in to help with some of the capacity issues and to bring projects to bear. It also provides avenues for innovation over the long haul, which is one of the principles of the CWIP. Performance-based contracting does provide some incentive for the private sector to develop new technologies that would give them a competitive advantage when it comes to this, and work those technologies through the state or the Chesapeake Bay expert panel process. So we're trying to provide avenues for innovation and for the private sector to leverage private capital and other innovative financing resources to make projects happen. So those are the three primary implementation methods that we see. We certainly welcome comment on all of those, whether you think one of them is better than the other, or you don't think any are appropriate, or you have thoughts on other ways we can implement But these are the ways we're certainly targeting, at least initially, and would love your input on those. Next slide, please. So as Carly and Ruth had mentioned earlier, there is a financing strategy that's ongoing that's paired with this effort as part of the other activities that Ruth described. It's being run by University of Maryland, Dan Neese there, and Joanne Throw with Throw Environmental. So those folks are working on the financing strategy, which, as I said, is ongoing now. It's kind of an interesting process in that they need to understand from us the geography and the BMPs and some of the implementation levels so that they can do their work. So it's kind of a little bit of a chicken and the egg, but the process is built into sort of this phased approach, which Ruth described, and it'll all be wrapped up as we move through this process. But anyway, to describe what's going on there, the first phase, which is ongoing now, they're working on now, is the evaluation and due diligence, where they're evaluating these existing financing capacities across the watershed. They're looking at and identifying innovative financing processes from across the country and even internationally. They're drafting a structure for a new Conowingo WIP financing system and a process to do that. And then that financing process and strategy, again, is based off of the information you're seeing today. We communicate with them regularly. They participate with the steering committee just as we do. That strategy is due to be completed at the end of December this year. And obviously we sort of will roll that process into your comments and the revision process moving forward. Phase 2 occurs after that, and that's essentially piloting the financing strategy. It's the initial program launch, where they'll launch the implementation and investment process at scale, and they'll essentially test the system there and identify opportunities, identify strengths and weaknesses and ways that they can improve the system. And that'll occur in 2020 through 2021. And then finally, completing the financing system and a full launch. They'll make any course adjustments based on that pilot and establish the permanent Conowingo financing system. And that occurs in 2021 through 2022 with a hopeful launch of the Conowingo financing system in 2022, which again would support the implementation required to meet this goal. So again, it's separate, it's a standalone WIP, and this would be the financing system strategy to support the Conowingo WIP goals. Next slide, please. So contingencies, these are ones, obviously to consider just in terms of what contingencies we see, but also maybe to provide a little bit of context for you as you think about your comments and what you might think about in terms of where we want to think about going, or maybe where you think we should go. So the first is to reevaluate the priority watersheds. Carly did a great job at showing you the priority watersheds that we've identified are the most effective watersheds. So we will get the most bang for our buck in the watersheds we've identified. However, if it's determined we can't meet our goal there, then we could reevaluate that. We could expand it. We could look at other watersheds in the Susquehanna River Basin that are below the median, so that don't quite perform as well as the ones that are identified. We'd like that to do a little bit more work to get the same benefit, but certainly a possibility. The other would be to expand the entire basin, to go outside of the Susquehanna River Basin, which is also a possibility. But as Carly indicated, there's even an additional sort of knock on those reductions, in some cases a significant one, in some cases not as significant. All depends on where in the bay that is implemented and its effect on dissolved oxygen in the bay. As Carly indicated, it may be as much as 5 times as much effort to get the same result as in the Susquehanna. And others, it's marginally more, but we would still likely need to do more. But that's a possibility. We could expand our target geography and identify additional watersheds. Next is to expand or extend our list of BMPs. And we look very closely at BMPs that are highly effective at nitrogen removal and are also cost effective with the added caveat of not taking too much land out of production. Certainly, we can look at other BMPs, and we would welcome comment from you all if you feel like there are cost-effective BMP opportunities on the landscape that we are overlooking, that you feel like the Conowingo WIP should include and we should look more strongly at. We are open to ideas, and we will certainly provide your comments to the steering committee as we look at other potential avenues for implementation on the BMP side. But we can look at other BMPs and maybe even look ahead at potential BMPs on the horizon that show great promise in terms of the Chesapeake Bay expert panel process and becoming an approved BMP. The third is dredging. Many of you are familiar with the dam and some of the proposals going on there. As Ruth indicated, Maryland is currently working on a dredging study there at the dam to characterize the sediment behind the dam, to do a pilot dredge, and to look to see if there's any beneficial reuse for that dredge material. So a lot of data still needs to be collected before we would understand what a credit associated with dredging could be. So we don't have the data as the CIT team yet to include that in the WIP now. It's not an approved BMP, so EPA will need to see some more information, but Maryland is working on that. Certainly, if it is shown to have promise and to be cost effective, then it's certainly something the Conowingo WIP could look at in terms of a contingency plan. And finally, sort of the worst case scenario, at least in my mind, is the reassigning of loans. So we have this 6 million pound gap. There's no doubt about that. The EPA and the states, the PSC, decided to take this unique approach to combining efforts to develop a unique independent WIP. We are not successful in this endeavor. We cannot get the load reductions. We cannot demonstrate success through this process. Then EPA can certainly take those loads and reallocate them to the states based on a mutually agreed upon calculus there. So essentially, we don't do it here. They can just go, Pennsylvania, here's your little bit more. Maryland, here's your little bit more. New York, here's your little bit more. Virginia, here's your new, or however they do it. And then it is part of the jurisdictional WIP. We're hoping to avoid that with this, but that's certainly a contingency out there that EPA could just reassign those loads back to the states and close the gap that way. We're hopeful that that doesn't happen, and we can be successful working with you all and the larger watershed community to make the Conowingo WIP and the financing that comes along with it a success. Next slide, please. So just kind of summing that up, I think with the contingencies and I think the flexibility we're trying to build into the WIP with regard to these contingencies really lets us look, or we're hoping to look forward at what might foster financing innovations, what might allow for private capital come into the picture to support some of these efforts. So what alternative approaches should we consider that might be able to do that? Also, as it relates to anticipated alternative and innovative BMPs or technologies that could achieve nitrogen reductions at a reduced cost. So again, talked a little bit about how we're hoping that maybe some of the pay for performance-based contracting might lead to this, but certainly we are open to comments related to contingencies and alternative approaches that may look to these anticipated alternative and innovative BMPs and new technologies that are on the horizon or that you're aware of that we may be able to look to achieve the reductions associated with the Conowingo WIP and maybe even the jurisdictional WIP as well. Next slide. So that's really pretty much it for the technical part of the discussion. We really wanted to leave the majority of the time for discussion with you all, try to answer questions, provide a venue for you to give comments. Again, the question earlier about verbal versus written, we really do appreciate you writing it, just so we make sure that we get your comment exactly right. If we just glean it from the text, you know, there's opportunity for us to get it wrong is there. So if you type it in, then we're sure we've got your comment the way you want it. But really, this is an opportunity for us to interact together, and for us to get information that we can take directly to the steering committee and to the principal staff committee. So Carly, I'll turn it over to you to work through this next phase.
Sure. So we already have some questions coming into the chat box. I can read some of these out. Thank you so much to Ted for sharing these. So we'll start with Ted's questions, and then please feel free to continue adding questions and comments into the text box, as Brian mentioned, and also feel free to also unmute yourself. So we'll just start with the first question posed by Ted. It says the original framework for the CWIP included dredging and included Exelon to be a part of the CWIP. Why doesn't dredging have a lot more emphasis, and why is Exelon not at the table? Brian, could you take this?
Yeah, sure. So as I indicated before, Maryland is working on a study now. Dredging is not an approved Chesapeake Bay program load reduction BMP. There is no associated load reduction with dredging at this time. So we cannot use it as a BMP. Maryland is working on that study. We were hopeful to be a little bit more aligned with that study. However, there have been some challenges, as I understand it, associated with permitting for some of that permitting for like the borings to do the sediment characterization and others. So I think that process is ongoing, and certainly we're interested in hearing more about it, but it's not an approved BMP. EPA will not allow us to identify it as an approved BMP for this plan. So there is no BMP for us to work with currently. As I indicated, we are looking at it as a contingency item, and we hope that as data becomes available, and as the Chesapeake Bay program considers it, that we can integrate it more. But at this point, it's just not an option for us because there's just not the data to support a reduction associated with it at this time. So that's where that stands. As far as Exelon goes, Exelon is engaged in a separate permitting process that's different from the Conowingo WIP. It is not part of this effort currently. It's completely independent. So the state of Maryland and Exelon are going through that process. Now, can Exelon or any third party potentially participate in the Conowingo WIP in the future? Sure. But that's not part of what we've been charged to do, as that process is completely independent and separate from what we've been tasked to do here, which is essentially figure out how to reduce the 6 million pounds of nitrogen in the most cost-effective way possible. So hopefully there'll be more information as Exelon and the state go through that permitting process, but right now it's a separate process that we're not directly engaged in.
Brian, if I could just add something to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You didn't really answer the question, because back in 2017, there was a lot of emphasis for Exelon to be part of these discussions. And the relicensing of the Conowingo Dam is absolutely 100% not part of this, but there was a lot of discussion previously about having them at the table. I'm sitting over here wondering why there isn't a representative engaged with everything that you guys are doing.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, the framework for the Conowingo WIP, which was set up by the principal staff committee, did not include Exelon. We, as Ruth indicated, we are sort of a hired grantee to support that effort and to work with the framework that the principal staff committee and EPA have established. Certainly, if you have comments to the effect of how you believe Exelon should or should not be a part of this, then we are happy to include that and push it forward. But again, we're working with a framework that was established prior to our being brought on as a grantee.
I can also add that the questions that you're submitting in the chat box, in particular, Ted, the questions about Exelon, if you would like to send those in an email to us, I'll give the instructions on the next slide to our ChesapeakeBay.net email. We could also follow up with you with some documentation about the framework and see if we can get some more specific answers for you. As you know, we're doing our best to kind of stick to the text in the draft as far as our team's role here. But this is a really very important question, and we understand that a lot of stakeholders have this question. We will absolutely include this in the notes that we put together for our report to the steering committee about concerns from stakeholders. As Brian mentioned, the more local stakeholders can put these questions and concerns into recommendations that they'd like to see in the WIP, the more, I believe the more effective and helpful that will be for the steering committee as they're considering revisions. So hopefully that at least gives you some direction for question number 2, question number 3 that you've put into the chat box. So any other, I guess I'll just kind of.
Well, I mean, I can take a stab at 3. I mean, I think regardless of whether Exelon or any other third party for that matter pays, this is more of a funding question, is who should pay for it. What I would encourage you to do is focus on, regardless of who is paying for it, is this a reasonable strategy? Is this an approach that makes sense? Are these the right BMPs? Is this the right location? Whether Exelon pays or Maryland pays or Pennsylvania pays or some other third party pays, you know, that what we would like feedback on is, what about the BMPs? What about the locations? Where are we, you know, where we are looking to implement, is that, you know, is that in line with your thinking, or do you have other suggestions? So we can certainly pass along your comments about the funding to our partners on activity 2. But yeah, I think in particular, you know, funding aside, is this the right mix of BMPs? Is this the right locations to work in? Is maybe what I would encourage you, at least with regard to this aspect of the plan, to look at and consider. And I'll just keep going, Carly, if that's good, on 4 there. So yeah, on the details on the CWIP, again, I'll refer you back to the financing team, and their work product will be out next month. They're looking specifically at this, about how the CWIP might be paid for, looking at how private capital and financing will be levied in. They have a whole process they're working on now. And in terms of the sources of private financing, again, that is Team 2's wheelhouse. And they are working on that now, and I will defer to them on that activity. Certainly, they have a lot that they are preparing to report out on soon. So, and then the other one is December 20th is the first part of the strategy. March 21st is, I think, the rollout of the pilot rollout. So it's a sort of a 2-phased approach in their work plan. If you want additional details on that specific work plan, again, I'm happy to forward those comments along to our partners at University of Maryland. 6, the impacts of climate change, the proposed load reductions. The jurisdictions are currently working on climate change. We have not been given an additional climate change budget yet. We have been notified that we will likely get one at some point, but they're still working out the nuances of what that will be. So it's likely we will have some more to do, but we also are already ahead of the game with our scenario. We're 700,000 pounds over the mark. So we've given ourselves a little bit of leeway there with regard to climate change, but we have not been given a specific target yet, but there has been indication that one will come soon. So it's likely that our load reduction obligation for the Conowingo will go up. We just don't know exactly how much, and is in part why we left our current load reduction, our current strategy scenario, implementing to higher than 6 million pounds reduced. There was no mention of sediment reduction upstream or within the Susquehanna River Reservoir. Our target is not sediment related, it's nitrogen related. We don't have a sediment target. We have a nitrogen and a phosphorus target. So that's what we're aiming for there.
So, but as far as, I mean, you know, we're dealing with 3 reservoirs. If you count York Haven, you can. You know, so Conowingo Reservoir is now at dynamic equilibrium. You know, it can't trap any more sediment. You know, the single largest threat, in my opinion, to the Chesapeake Bay is the loading that's coming from these reservoirs. All the sediment that's been trapped behind these reservoirs for, 90 years. And again, we could talk about Exelon all day and their responsibility to mitigate those effects of scour. But wouldn't it be beneficial to have some type of sediment reductions, plan in this? We understand nitrogen and phosphorus is the major culprit, but sediment is too. Like, sediment is a huge part of this. And to not account for any sediment reductions, I think is just, it just makes the plan, in my opinion, almost moot to begin with.
No, I appreciate the comment. Yeah, I would encourage you to submit it. Again, the target that we're given by EPA is nitrogen and phosphorus. So that's the approach. Certainly, the trade-off with sediment is certainly if we targeted some practices purely for sediment reduction, we might not hit, or it was very likely we won't hit the nitrogen target, which is essentially the situation that most of the states are in now, where they're hitting the phosphorus target and they're doing pretty good on sediment, but they're not getting anywhere near the nitrogen target. So EPA was basically like, you all need to focus on nitrogen. And that's the emphasis, or that's the approach that EPA has decided to take. And that's the approach that we've been following, is to try to target nitrogen. But certainly, valid comment, please provide it and we will certainly include it.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned that the WIP loads will be incorporated into the PA tier 2 and 3 cap loads. Is that true? If so, why are those additional CWIP loads put on those counties when they are not put into the pilot counties? So, Carly, do you want to take a crack at this, or do you want me to do it?
I can provide a little bit of clarification on this one first, Brian. So the load reduction targets and the models that have been developed so far have not been assigned to counties. The analysis was not run by county, and the strategy is for the jurisdiction in its entirety. So it's only been calculated for the priority geographies within each jurisdiction. So it's not yet been broken down into the county level. The reason why we brought up the county action plan process is because we want to find ways to work within existing planning efforts. So the Conowingo WIP is not an additional planning requirement for any counties. It is a standalone WIP, so it does get a little bit complex here about how this is going to be rolled out. But we want to assure you that we're working very, very closely with Pennsylvania DEP about how best to engage local stakeholders like yourselves when it comes to considering the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan. The reason why we've been directed to engage the Tier 1 and Tier 2 counties at this point is because you have already been through your CAP process, and we're hoping that you can provide some specific feedback on challenges toward implementation that you've already identified as a community that we could potentially integrate into this new approach to WIP planning. When it comes to the it's actually the Tier 3 and Tier 4 counties that have not developed their CAPs yet. That's when our team can be more involved with CAP planning and see if there are opportunities to integrate some of the Conowingo WIP components into those additional CAPs, but they should be considered separate targets, independent strategies. Pennsylvania is still responsible for the load reductions in the Phase 3 WIP. When it comes to the loads being put on the pilot counties, who has the authority to do that now or in the immediate future? As Brian mentioned, the Conowingo WIP, in its when it was originally envisioned, it was a collective effort among the jurisdictions. In terms of responsibility of implementation, Brian, maybe you could fill in the answer to that question. Again, as Brian mentioned, when it comes to the contingency plan, it could be that the jurisdictions are assigned responsibility, but as of now, the jurisdictions have not been assigned the responsibility associated with these loads.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, at this point, the loads for the Conowingo WIP are the obligation of this team of the framework to come up with a solution to achieve that load reduction. The real question is, if this doesn't work, what's the next option? And certainly we don't have the authority to do that. But if we fail, if the Conowingo WIP isn't effective, then certainly EPA and the partnership will work together to reallocate those loads to the states, which would then be likely included in the jurisdictional WIP requirements moving forward. So we're hoping that doesn't happen. The point of the Conowingo WIP is to allow the states to continue to focus on the hard work at reaching the jurisdictional WIP and create this innovative process to tackle the load associated with the Conowingo. So it wouldn't be it's not in our purview to make that call or to do that. And then even then it would be allocated to the states, then it'd be the states' responsibility or purview to allocate that load from the state level down to the counties or however they want to do it. But the point of the CWIP is to try to avoid that.
The next question, I believe you mentioned funding and financing raised by the CWIP personnel can be shared for Chesapeake Phase 3 WIP implementation in Pennsylvania. Did I hear that correctly? Brian, you might be the best person to answer.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what we're looking at is what avenues make the most sense for you all. What seems to make sense. I mean, certainly one way we see potentially moving forward is to provide funding for these additional program areas. The Conowingo WIP provide additional funding for these program areas and their associated staff to do more work, and therefore share in that pathway of implementation. The Conowingo WIP would take some credit relative to the amount of financial input it has into that process, but that's certainly one way we think might work. But again, we're open to comments, whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea or the nuances to pulling that off. But certainly we see that as one potential option is to help get more personnel and more funding available for these program areas to implement projects on the landscape at a higher rate than is currently being done with just the jurisdictional WIP funding.
I'll
So
pause quickly, Brian, just to say that we really appreciate all of the conversation, the comments that are coming in the chat box. We'll do our best to get through all of the questions specifically, but please take advantage of this time to continue adding your comments into the chat box, and we can assure you that those will be documented. Brian, do you want to address the next Ted's?
Sure. Well, I don't know if it's an empty promise, Ted. I mean, I think this is a huge challenge, obviously, and EPA has hired a team of experts to help figure out the financing stuff. I mean, I think Carly, myself, and Ruth, we're sort of watershed people and stormwater and water resource people, and we've been tasked with trying to figure out this technical side of things. Certainly, the financing of this is very challenging, but I think also offers some unique opportunities as well. I don't know, they have a whole team of people that they are consulting with to develop their strategy. I don't know if Harbor Rock is one of those, but they do have a whole host of private sector and other public sector people who they are consulting with on coming up with a financing strategy that will work. So again, I wish I had more to share with you on that. That team is working, and all I can say is it's coming. You should have some more information on that in December from that team. And like I said, they do have quite a roster of financial experts and folks who have been involved in mitigation banking and environmental restoration across the country. So more to come from that. And again, we're happy to share your comments and questions and concerns with that team.
Thank you.
So going down to the next two comments, Susan and Letice Brown also just chimed in about Exelon. How can anyone expect farmers, et cetera, to buy into this with no participation of Exelon will not be met with favor. Letice says Exelon needs to be at the table and a healthy contributor to the CWIP. I don't see any other legitimate reason why they shouldn't. We will absolutely document these responses. Rachel asks, is there an approach or strategy to get the buy-in from willing landowners? Most of the BMPs are ag, and there will need to be incentives for the farmers. Have any been discussed? I will say that at this point, the Conowingo WIP doesn't get down to that level of detail. I think it'll be important in the next phase when it comes to milestone planning to tailor any implementation strategies to the community needs and those interest and implementation opportunities in each community. Again, this is across Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York. So I think it's an opportunity to support local efforts. When it comes to incentives for the farmers, have there been any discussed? I think that is absolutely something that the financing strategy and the financing team is considering. Brian, do you have any more detail about?
Yeah, I can share some here. Yeah, this is a great point, and as Carl indicated, yeah, it's something certainly that we view as needing to sort out as we move forward. But at this level here, it's kind of just a repointed in the right direction. So in terms of an approach to get buy-in from willing landowners, we've had several meetings like this, and we've had input from others. There's the acknowledgement that we've heard there are people who could do this, but there's not enough of them, right? That we need more people, we need more boots on the ground if you want this to happen. So a strategy could be to, again, provide more planners or more boots on the ground to do that, or more funding for those folks, understanding that there's strategies in place now, but they need additional support to get there. On the private sector side, we've heard quite a bit from the private sector that many of them have projects ready to go, really. they are quite effective at working with private landowners and would very much like the opportunity to engage in the Conowingo WIP process. So it kind of depends on who we're hearing from as to what approach or strategy we should take. So this is a little bit of us kind of asking you all, which strategy or approach do you think is the most beneficial or we should look at the most? But certainly those incentives to farmers have been discussed, adding additional funds to cost share programs, enhancing cost share programs further has been some things we've discussed or had similar comments come in. And again, private sector folks really just looking for the opportunity to engage and have an opportunity to get these projects going, and they themselves work and incentivize the landowners to participate. So a couple different ways that or a couple different sides of that discussion that we've had, and to give you an idea of the types of comments that are coming in currently related to this topic.
The next comment or question, I think it was Felicia. Yep. I understand the need to focus on the strategy, but I don't think you can separate the strategy from the funding. Without both components, you can't determine if it's a realistic plan or not. Absolutely. We would agree with that 100%. I think that I've heard Brian say chicken and the egg when it comes to the financing strategy and the implementation strategy. I think that there was a need to give more direction to the financing team in terms of the geographies and the types of practices that would be included. I think that the extension of the public comment period gives us a greater opportunity as well with some of the documentation for the financing team coming out in December. The public comment period for the draft WIP has been extended to January 20th. So you will have some opportunity to review some more of that funding information now that we have the draft WIP out. Brian, I wonder if you want to jump in here as well about Felicia's comment.
Yeah, no, I think you did a good job there. I completely agree, Felicia. I don't want to, in my mind, it's the chicken and the egg. And I guess we're the chicken. I don't know. Maybe we're the egg. Whichever one goes first, that's the one we were decided to be. So I think I've been around the horn on this. Certainly it would be helpful to have that financing strategy in place for us too. But this was the path forward. Again, I think Carly hit the nail on the head in terms of the main considerations that I've heard from the from the financing team, which was they needed to know the geography and they needed to know the types of BMPs to kind of go to the next level of their work. So the framework in which EPA and the program set up was they wanted us to develop this plan and to get it out to the public to get response from it while the financing strategy is being assembled. So I understand it's a perfectly valid comment. Completely appreciate it. We will certainly include it. And again, there should be more information on that financing strategy out next month. But yeah, perfectly valid, good comment. The project sort of timeline is what it is.
Felicia's next comment, private funding partners definitely needs to be a part of the funding plan because it is typically the most flexible funding. Jumping down, I see that Rachel had a similar comment. There will be a large lift to get the farming community to commit to government funding. Private funding needs to be included. There is a list of the consultants that the Activity 2 team has engaged as far as developing the financing strategy. There are several private private companies and they've been involved at least in developing of the plan. Brian, I don't know if you want to jump in as well here.
Sure. I mean, I want to be a little bit cautious of our friends. This is not our project, but yeah, I mean, they're working with a whole host of experts. This comment is an excellent comment about the private sector. I think this is a very valuable comment that we greatly appreciate. I think there was another comment above or below that, David, about working with the Plain Sec community and the private sector, having some more success there. This is exactly the type of comments we need to hear from you. Because I can say the same thing and it won't carry the same weight as it coming from you all who have been, you know, in the trenches, so to speak. So excellent comments. We really appreciate these because they are directly to some of the discussions we've had in the past with the steering committee and others. So very valid points. Excellent comments.
And likewise, the more detail you can provide about the specific challenges that private funding can overcome, I know that we're all very familiar with that. The documentation will be very, very helpful if you have recommendations specific to those challenges that private funding will be helpful with. Next comment, competition for project sites will occur since the county CAPs are simultaneously working with MS4s and outside the urban areas to identify project areas. A quick note about MS4s, and I don't think that I emphasized this when I was going through the modeling process, is that the urban practices that were considered in the model were only implemented or only modeled outside of MS4 regulated areas. So the understanding is that MS4 practices are already planned in the pollution reduction plans. They're already counted toward the phase 3 WIPs. So those regulated areas were not included when the urban practices were modeled. But yet another good comment about concerns over competition between and how the CAPs and the phase 3 WIPs can be complementary with the CWIP.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when it comes to, these are good comments again, and some of this has been discussed. When it comes to particularly York, Lancaster, and Adams County, we know that there's a heavy lift here, that you all have been asked to do quite a bit. So these types of comments, I think I saw one further down from Felicia about how much land is available, or certainly valuable comments that we need to hear. The reality of it is that we've got to get this 6 million pounds, and if we don't get it in York or at Lancaster Adams, we need to get it somewhere. So the question really becomes where do we go? And I think what we need to know is what, you know, how much can we do in these different communities, so as we look ahead, we can start to determine, you know, where do we move things around to? Do we need to expand the geography? Do we need to do more BMPs, etc.? So those, we understand that you all are being asked to do quite a bit, and this is your opportunity to let us know kind of where you feel like this puts you, so that we can relay that information to the steering committee and the principal staff committee.
I see that Kate has posed a question for the York team. How do you plan to separate this from your CAP? We encourage everyone here to type in their ideas and their responses to that question in the chat box. That will be very, very helpful feedback for the steering committee. Next question from Diane Olson. How is rulemaking by states helping or hindering our efforts? We need to be able to get approvals to implement BMPs. Brian, I'm not sure how to answer that question. Could you chime in here?
Sure, I can try to take a stab at this one. So I think, again, some of this challenge about we need to be able to get approvals to implement BMPs. I think, you know, just a little bit of my sort of thought process is, this is where I look a little bit at some of that pay for performance-based contracting, or performance-based contracting, because really you place the onus on the private sector, the project offerer, to get the approvals to implement those BMPs. I'm not sure exactly which specific BMPs you're talking about. Certainly when we have talked about the timeline of implementation, when the Conowingo WIP could be implemented, we have discussed, and we'll talk a little about this a little bit more, the challenges with getting permits to implement some of the projects and the timeline it takes to do that. And, from when financing is available to the project comes online, what's that lag time look like? So certainly from that standpoint, there has been discussions as to, how does this impact the timeline and how do we get these projects through permitting, et cetera. Not sure exactly how to address the rulemaking by the state's comment. I don't know. Bruce, do you have any thoughts on that one?
For those counties that are like York, that are currently implementing their own county WIPs, I would definitely take advantage of your CAP coordinators and meeting with DEP for some of those pre-application meetings to talk through some of that permitting. If your question is more specific to some, upcoming or pending rulemaking, I'm afraid I can't comment on that, but we will definitely share your comments and your questions with the team as we go forward.
I do realize that I skipped over a comment here from David Booth with York County Ag Preserve. David, we'll get to your comment, and then I think we have two more here in the chat, and we'll wrap up this part of the conversation. But again, I've got instructions later on about how to send any additional comments over to our email address. So just going back up here, this is David Booth with York County Ag Preserve. We've seen a major interest in plain sect ownership of our preserved farms in York County, with more coming. They've expressed they are more willing to receive loans from the private sector for doing projects compared to receiving government grants or involvement. So I see value in having private sector connections who want to lend or get involved in projects that could help plain sect farmers reduce nitrogen loads coming from their farms. David, I think this is an excellent and very detailed comment that will be really helpful for the steering committee. I'm thinking about projected growth and changes in population and how that was incorporated into the CWIP, but I think the local communities can provide a lot more detailed insight about how they see their communities changing over time and considerations that we could include in the CWIP. Brian, do you want to add anything more to that?
I think you're good. I mean, it's a good comment. I think we've heard similar things from others. So,
going back down to Cindy's comment, I'll read this. The WIP story is beautiful, and if it came to fruition, would be amazing. From the vantage point of someone in the field, it sounds like a fantasy. Obviously, there are proven BMPs in the geographical area that you have chosen will result in the best bang for your buck in terms of nitrogen reduction. The how of getting this to become reality seems vague and a fantasy story. Neither York or Lancaster have been able to meet their nitrogen reduction targets, yet somehow you plan on finding more nitrogen reductions. Also, the creative funding sounds like BS unless you have some sort of money tree that we are not aware of. Any money you receive could have gone to our work. I know this seems strong, but I am feeling frustrated. Cindy, first off, I would say that it is the reality of the situation, and we need to hear your honest feedback on this. So we do very, very much appreciate it, and it's important to be frank during this time, during this public comment period. So we do appreciate the comment and the honesty. Brian, any response or thoughts about Cindy's comment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, this is a huge challenge, right? There's no doubt about it. The 6 million pounds isn't going away. It's not going to go away. So we've got to figure out some way to do it. We understand that, again, York and Lancaster have been asked to do quite a bit. There has been significant challenges in meeting the nitrogen reduction target, which again is why EPA sort of focused us on that nitrogen reduction target. Again, I know Dan and Joanne are working very hard on the financing side of things. They are talking about some really interesting things. And I hope that as they go through their process there, that some of that comes to fruition and they can make it work. Again, that process is unfolding currently. I know they are working in several big meetings this week. So they're working hard at trying to address that creative funding thing. You are correct. That is some of the things that they are considering, is that if there was more money for these same types of BMPs, then it would have likely been uncovered by now. But that's part of the reason for looking at some of the performance-based contracting and trying to incentivize the private sector to look at more innovative, cost-effective ways to get things done. So I know that that's a big part of what they're looking at and how that may be able to help to reduce costs. But you're right, this is a huge challenge. The 6 million pounds didn't appear overnight, and it's not going to go away overnight. What our goal here with this is to try to get this done through the Conowingo WIP process so it doesn't get reallocated to the states. And we hope that by providing this more innovative approach, that we can leverage additional sources of funding. So yeah, it's a new approach, and it goes to this comment really, which is how can we think about this differently and try to find new and innovative sources of funding. And so EPA has hired a team of experts to try to help figure that out. What we were really focused on was what are the most cost-effective options we have available, or at least that's what the steering committee selected for the priority scenario to go forward. And we recognize that there's a challenge. Again, we understand, and part of the issue here and part of the dynamic of this conversation with you all is you're already being asked to do a lot. And maybe we don't get a lot out of York County or Lancaster County for the Conowingo WIP. Maybe that's the case, but we need to hear that from you all on the ground, because you're in the trenches, you're on the front lines, and I know the frustration of having to deal with this monumental task you have now with the jurisdictional WIP with what resources you have. But our goal here is to try to come up with a new approach that prevents you from having to do more. So I appreciate the frustration. We're trying to come up with some new ways of doing this. And certainly if you have thoughts in terms of ways you think we can get this done on the ground, then we'd love to hear them and take them forward. We want to hear your ideas for what works so that we can integrate it in and try to find and try to identify that so our partners can identify funding for it.
So I'm afraid that we have we've run out of time here for this part of the agenda. So I just want to say that you can keep your questions and comments coming. If we weren't able to get to your question, you can also email it directly to us. The instructions are on the slide right now, and we'll work with Rachel to make sure that you all get a copy of these slides. But again, very, very grateful for the time on your agenda today, for all the good conversation. The comment period is open until January 20th. We just got an extension on that. So please, if any other questions or comments come up between now and then, let us know. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Carly and Brian, for sticking in there and presenting this to us. I think it was really beneficial, lots of great comments, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate everybody's time and comments and input. Please keep them coming. We're glad to have it. It really is what we need to hear, and we will certainly utilize all of this as we move forward with the steering committee.
All right, and like Brian and Carly said, as we move on into the second part of the presentation here for our normal coalition business, if you still have a comment that you would like to put in the chat, you most certainly can, and we'll get those to Carly. All righty, if Thanks. Perfect. Thank you again. All right. Bear with me one second. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see? All right. I cannot see the chat box, so if there's any questions that pop up with this part of the presentation, Lindsay, if you could chime in, or Felicia or Pam, and let me know that someone's asking something.
Gotcha.
Thanks. In the interest of time, we have some updates from our action teams. I'm going to start with the legislative and programmatic changes in the revenue building, and then I'll pass it off to Latisse for education and outreach. The legislative and programmatic changes team is continuing the work with the watershed permit concept. We are really hoping and wanting to take a project through the DEP pre-app meetings to kind of test this watershed permit concept out. We're on the lead of several projects that could potentially help us with that, so just being patient. The next meeting for that team is going to be December 18th at 1 p.m. The revenue building team has been meeting with the project implementation team as well as the data management team and discussing the evolution of the team for year 2. As everyone probably remembers, they completed a really big funding spreadsheet this year, and we're going to try to put that into use in year 2 as well. Latisse, if you're still there, I'm going to pass it off to you for education and outreach.
Yes, I am still here. Let me bring up my notes. So we've been continuing to work with Lumi on creating the brand and logo for the York County CAP. We've also been discussing around the idea of changing the name to something more catchy and understandable to the public. This is something we've been tossing around, talking about, but if we do decide to go that route, we would like input from everyone. Rachel, did you have more to say about that?
Yeah, we've talked to some other action teams that have met in the past couple of, I guess, week or 2 weeks since we've talked to Lumi. And folks on those teams are in support of the possible name change of York County Coalition for Clean Waters. So I'm hoping to find support or opposition today from the folks on the call. If you are in support of the name change, that's great. If you aren't in support of the name change, I would ask that you voice that and why in the chat so we can take that into consideration. A big reason why we're thinking about changing the name is, like Latisse said, it's very long, and I know we love acronyms, but YCC4CW doesn't say anything. At least I can't think of making it say anything. So let us know if you're in support of that or not. So back to you, Latisse.
Awesome, thank you. So we've also done some creative thinking and giving them some staff ideas on what we like and what we do not like as far as brand and colors go for the logo. It's an ongoing process, and I think pretty soon we'll be getting a couple of prototypes that are prepared for us by them. And we're hoping to get your all opinion on that as well, just to kind of see where the warmth of the water is for that. And that should be coming maybe in the next week or 2. We also had some discussion for leads on riparian buffer areas. Right now, Central High School is on lockdown due to COVID, as most of us probably know. They've been unresponsive, understandably so, due to the issues that they're dealing with. So I figured I'd let them try to deal with what they're dealing with, and maybe mid-December see if I can reach out and they can maybe give me a time frame in which they think that things will settle down a little bit, and we can open up that dialogue again about the riparian buffer on their property. We also added to the possible list of the Spring and Sperry wastewater treatment plant. Some of you know that they're trying to, they're actually doing a stream restoration across the street from the plant that Spring and Sperry Township also owns. So maybe to add one to that, if they wanted to do a riparian buffer on their property on the water or wastewater treatment plant side, that's something we could also ask to see if they're interested in kind of mixing the two together. We also thought about Southeastern School District, since their high school, middle school, and elementary schools are on one large piece of land. It would be great for the students, kind of like what we did in the northern part of the county, and see if they would be interested in doing some riparian buffers as well. There was also one thought about for the Muddy Creek Railroad and possibly doing one along there. So those are some areas that we're thinking about, and I will probably reach out to these areas to see if they're interested in doing riparian buffers. Last but not least, we are also discussed helping the data management team with field docs on BMPs. We had a lengthy discussion on what information is needed
Mailbox?
and the ones that would
Just
be
over here. I'll
acceptable into
take it
the
off.
plan.
It's the post office box, but I mean, the post office is up.
Cindy, you're not on mute.
Oh, sorry.
You're good.
I thought that was my computer talking to me. But anyway, so yeah, so we're unsure what kind of information is needed from the data management team. So we're waiting to hear from them. But Molly and I are willing to get the process starting if we have BMPs that are acceptable into the plan. And I think that's it for me. If anyone has any questions or concerns, let me know. Oh, our next meeting is January 13th at 1 p.m.
Thanks so much, Latisse.
You're welcome.
Right. Moving on. Jody had to, I don't believe she popped back on. She had another commitment this afternoon. So I'm going to go ahead with the project implementation report as well. There are partners who are continuing to secure funding and implementing BMPs in the county. That hasn't changed from our last report out. We have started work on a spreadsheet for project tracking. Our last meeting we talked about there's just so much out there going on and so much to know and keep track of, and what can we do to have that knowledge and just know. So we're thinking about maybe some different projects that we would focus on, and then criteria of what we would want to know about them for that projects that are planned or planning. The project implementation team has decided to hold meetings bi-monthly for year 2, and they're going to be meeting next January 15th at 10 a.m. if anyone would like to tune in. Roy, are you on the line for
Thanks,
data
Rachel.
management? Oh. Sorry, who is that?
It's Jody. I'm just
Oh,
picking
thanks.
my kids up, so thanks for chiming in there.
Hey, no worries at all. Thanks, Jody.
I'm here, Rachel.
Thanks, Roy. Take it away for data management.
Since we last met, well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. Since we last met, the team has met twice with USGS. The first was just a general overall meeting to get an idea of what kind of data is collected, how that data can be used, the validity of the data, just to get a nice basis or ground of how that data might be used by the team and by the coalition and reporting it to the public. We also had another meeting that followed up that meeting, which was more of a deep dive. Some of our folks have been monitoring the data and had some questions about readings that were off a little bit, where they felt were off a little bit, or how some of those readings may be adjusted or things like that. So that was the purpose of the second meeting. Joe Doris with USGS joined our team. He's leading the water quality monitoring for York County. We were asked to refocus on data collection now that Field Docs is in place. So we're currently looking at a data collection template. We had started that before Field Docs was implemented, but that kind of was put on hold until field docs was done. So we need to go back and look at the template and see how that needs to be changed to fit the data collection for field docs. We're also putting together an informational piece on eligible projects that we can get out to municipalities and other folks so they know what kind of projects we're looking for, and also maybe an outreach piece. We'll probably need to work with the other teams on that information. And finally, as part of that refocus, we're also looking at what areas we might want to focus on for collecting data to be inputted into field docs. Gary Peacock with York County Conservation District, his final day, I believe, was yesterday. He did retire, and as part of that, has stepped down from the team. So it was mentioned that maybe we might want to approach the Conservation District to see if they might have a representative they might want to sit in on our meetings as well. We had been working on a water quality monitoring brochure. It's a basic informational piece to get out to the public, the agricultural community, and others that might be interested, just outlining the water quality monitoring program that's going on in the county. That brochure is mostly done. There's a few changes like for maps and things like that, but I believe it's almost finalized. As part of our meeting, we also discussed an annual report for projects that are implemented or data is collected, and a report on water quality monitoring. Some of the discussion was around maybe putting out a report 3 months after USGS releases their annual report to have like a user-friendly, maybe more generalized report for the public. And we also discussed maybe having a semi-annual internal report, which would just be for the use by the coalition. So lots going on in the data management team right now. Our next meeting is December 4th at 1 p.m. That's all I have, Rachel, unless you have something to add.
I don't have anything to add. Thanks so much, Roy. Does anybody have questions at this point before we keep going?
Do you have an idea where you might use the brochure for the water quality management, and could education and outreach be of any use with getting this to different entities that might find it useful?
Yes, initially I think it's was planned to be used for some of the agricultural outreach that's going on to the agricultural field, and we definitely be looking into the education outreach folks to help us advertise that information. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that takes care of it.
All right.
Anybody else? All righty. So as everybody probably is aware, we have submitted the annual report for year one, and I just wanted to kind of highlight some accomplishments. I know we meet bi-monthly and action teams meet monthly, and sometimes it just feels like you get lost in the sauce. So I wanted to put it out there that we really have accomplished a lot in the first year. So we have 2 newly funded positions at the Conservation District, with a 3rd on the way. We've implemented a state-of-the-art water quality monitoring program. I mean to say, this thing is really impressive. We did the funding map with revenue building. We secured a NIFWIF grant for a long-term messaging strategy. Many, many trees were planted by the master watershed stewards. Several projects were completed through the Chesapeake Bay Pollutant Reduction Plan. CAP dollar projects are underway or nearly completed. The Conservation Excellence Grant launched. It's $1 million for York County for agricultural practices. At the last Conservation District Board meeting, they did report they have 4 applications for cover crop programs for that. It's great news. We started a recap newsletter that comes out bi-monthly. We're always looking for submissions to that, ideas on BMPs to focus on, projects to focus on. If you'd like to submit something, let us know. Field Doc was released. That's going to be an important tool for us, and we're really excited to use the data management's help to get some information put into Field Doc in year 2. And I think that the most important thing to mention to everybody on this call is that volunteers continue to show up for water quality despite a pandemic. And I think that just deserves a pat on the back, a thank you, and just, I hope everyone recognizes that none of this could be done without you. So we sent out a little bit of a survey to kind of help us propel into year 2. And I just wanted to go over some results of the 5 questions that we posed. So the first was, do you feel the current categories of the action teams meet our needs going into year 2? Most everybody agreed yes, but some suggested comments are that we need to revise the action team mission statements and duties, and we need to find broader participation on action teams. For example, more people in the agricultural community on our teams and more local businesses on our team as well. The second question was, is the meeting frequency meeting our needs? So monthly for action teams, bi-monthly for the coalition. Largely, people agreed yes, and the comments suggest bi-monthly meetings for action teams in year 2. That's totally up to the discretion of each team. I know 2 of them are going to take that route so far. If you're on a team and you're thinking of maybe taking that route, it's okay. Third question was, we've been meeting via Zoom pretty much all of year 1 since March. If circumstances change and meeting in person becomes feasible again in year 2, how would everybody like to meet? There was a lot of suggestions. Mix of both is the winner of this category, but some of the comments were alternate face-to-face and Zoom, a once a year in person to celebrate accomplishments, and Zoom the rest of the year so that more people can join on the calls. In person twice a year, in-person field trips, and keep things virtual because it's easier for busy schedules. Who else should we bring into this effort? Comments are municipalities and municipal officers. Again, ag community, farmers and farming organizations, private landowners, politicians or local representatives, connect with the Plains Sec community, the board members of the York County Community Foundation, and just citizens personally interested in this kind of work or advocacy or water quality. If anybody has any idea of a name that fits into any of these categories of a person to reach out to and simply start a conversation about what the heck we're doing here in York County Coalition for Clean Waters, let me know. I would excitedly reach out to them. And the last question, what would make us more efficient in year 2? Comments included private funding, improve information sharing via Microsoft Teams. So use Microsoft Teams a little bit more, defeat COVID-19 to get back to normal, more education and outreach, which we will definitely have through that NIFWIF grant, the bi-monthly meetings again, encourage folks to change action teams if revised mission no longer aligns with personal interests. So If anybody out there is feeling bored on their action team and wants to switch, by all means, please do. Just please don't leave. We need you. Field trips for next year, an improvement of the data collection and reporting. Data management is hot on that trail. Work together across action teams more. I definitely agree with that. And it seems here at the end of year one, we've started doing that much more than we have been in the beginning of the year. And this one, I actually might have been my favorite, but do not end an action team meeting without assigned tasks. I think that that might be especially more feasible with a bi-monthly schedule. So people will have even longer to complete the task. So I really appreciate everybody who answered these questions. We have our leadership team meeting next week, and I think we're gonna go over these and think about the changes that we should make and implement them, and we'll fill everybody in at the January meeting. Any questions before we kind of wrap it up here? All right, just want to mention the grants and other opportunities. Conservation Excellence Grant Program still is money there. They're still accepting applications. Like I said, there's 4 cover crop applications. If you know a farmer who has talked about cover crops before, they might not know about the Conservation Excellence Grant Program. So maybe you should mention it to them. Mark Flayhardy is our contact at the Conservation District for all things CEG. The Watershed Friendly Property Certification is now live. I'm wondering, Cindy, do you have anything to say about that? Or
I
give us
can,
a little,
Rachel.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so it's live. The first 250 people who qualify get a free yard sign. So I'm writing an article for the newspaper for it, and we're going to be having some more webinars and stuff to promote it. But yeah, so sign up if you do a lot of watershed friendly stuff on your property.
Thanks, Jody.
I can send those to share with everyone if you want.
Yeah, definitely. That would be helpful. And everyone keep your eye peeled for the article in the next issue of Recap. I think a lot of people on the call, you might be able to get one of these yard signs for your yard. So I think it's a great opportunity to showcase that, you know, you're caring for the environment. Last but not least, the DEP permit pre-application meetings for Bay projects, chapter 102 and 105, they still are standing meetings on Tuesdays from 10 to 12. Please email me if you know of a project that could go through, if you have something that you would like to take to this meeting. It's completely open, and we definitely have not been using this resource like I hope we could. One more thing, boots on the ground. We kind of started this last meeting to show opportunities if you want to get your hands dirty out there. Being that we're inching closer and closer to the winter months, we're slim pickings, but Horn Farm is doing riparian ripped volunteer days. So if you want to get a full body workout, you should sign up. They are preparing the land for the 18,000 trees that are going to be planted in spring. So there's still 3 dates available that they need help for. November 30th, December 1st, December 2nd, all from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. There's a phone number there. Call and let them know that you're ready to help, or you can email that email address there. This is going to be an amazing project next year. I'm sure that there's going to be more volunteer opportunities on the planting end as well. Next steps and moving forward, a lot of these we keep the same. Keep outreaching to local businesses. Please bring people into the mix. We need more voices. We need more advocates. We need more volunteers. Funding opportunities, let's keep finding them, especially private ones. Willing landowners, do you know one? Talk it up. There's money out there. There's lots of money out there. We just got to find the people. Our December recap issue, please share it. Our social medias, be on the lookout for our new look. Will be coming, I would say, in the coming months. And of course, most importantly, from this meeting today, we're going to submit the Conowingo WIP comments. If you have any more, this is your last chance to put them in your chat. Thanks, everybody. Is there any questions or anything anyone wants to discuss? I'm not hearing anything. So mark your calendar, January 15th from 1 to 3. We're going to Zoom again. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. Thank you, everybody, for commenting. Thank you, everyone, for your continued support. I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving and happy holidays. And we'll see you in the new year. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.